Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the University of Melbourne's Water Security Series today. My name is Meenakshi Arora, and I am Associate Professor in the Melbourne School of Engineering at the university. My research focus is around water quality modeling and treatment, and also looking at fit-for-purpose water supply systems. I am also responsible to coordinate a monthly event for this seminar series, just like today. So keep an eye for a seminar happening every month. You should be receiving an email from us. So before I introduce the event tonight, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place today, the land of Wurundjeri people. And I pay my respects to their elders and families, past, present, and emerging. So this event this evening is part of a series in which we are going to discuss the important issues around water security. And through that, we want to bring in thought leaders in academia, industry, and government to provide some evidence-based insights and raise the debate or quality of debate around these key issues. And as a part of that, tonight we are going to discuss the impact of recent bushfires on water resources. And to discuss that important topic, we have three experts working in this space for many, many years. We have Professor Patrick Lane from Faculty of Science, University of Melbourne. We have Associate Professor Gary Sheridan from University of Melbourne as well. And we have Mr. Jeff Steendam from Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. So I'll briefly introduce all the speakers and then we'll start to hear from them. So Professor Patrick Lane has been a forest hydrologist for over 23 years. His areas of research include measurement and modeling of evapotranspiration and stream flow in response to disturbance and growth dynamics and processes of erosion and water quality from forested landscapes. Associate Professor Gary Sheridan's research focus is on hydrology and geomorphology of flammable upland forests. Gary has an interest in understanding and modeling the effects of fire on runoff processes, soil erosion, and water quality. And Jeff brings in huge experience and manages the hydrology and climate science team in Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water, and Planning. The team invests in a range of water and climate research activities and works with Victorian water sector to help access and apply the science. Jeff has worked in the water resource planning roles in the department for over 15 years, and before that he has worked in the consulting firms in Australia as well as UK. So without further ado, I would like to now invite Professor Patrick Lane to provide us a bit of overview about the issue we are talking today, and before we then move on to listen from Gary and then to the discussion. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you. Before I start, I should say that the preferred option of the organisers were not really to have presentations, but of course, people like us who do this for a living feel that a bit stressful. So we had to put a few slides up, but it's really just thought-provoking. There is no actual results of the outcomes of the fire. There's just some, a few things for us to think about as we go on in terms of fire and hydrology. So the first thing I'd like to call everybody's attention to is the fact there's lots of it, and we all know that. But one thing to notice on this slide here is that there are a number of areas in our forests that have been burnt multiple times in short intervals. And this is something that maybe we should keep in our minds, because this is a quite significant outcome of our current climate and the climate we seem to be going into, where we wouldn't normally expect the fire return intervals to be like some of these, and some of them have been burnt 4 times. Some little bits of the blue, I think, up around Dargo, which must be a very tricky place to be. So just keep that in mind, that this multiple fire issue is a significant one, we think, in terms of predicting what will happen going forward. I couldn't resist putting an equation up. And the reason only is just to remind people that after the transpiration, the interception and the evaporation, what we have left over is our stream flow. And in that number is for a kind of upland forest, I guess. Could be a bit more, could be a bit less. But if the evapotranspiration is turned off by the fires, then in theory there's a lot of extra water available to the system early on in the recovery phase. I don't need to go there. So anyway, we go from something like that, which is a 80-year-old mountain ash stand, to a dead stand there, and obviously there are large areas. I can't remember when this photo was from. It could have been taken any time in the last 16 years from our multiple fire events, but that's what we're talking about as occurring. And just in terms of thinking about the impacts, then we need to take, the first thing we need to take into account is the fire intensity. So how hot has been the fire? Are we able to relate that to the species that are burnt in terms of the forested areas? And you can see this is the fire severities are highly mosaicked across the landscape. So in fact, in predicting, looking at a burn map, as we've seen lots of them over the last 2 months or so, kind of thinking about what will happen there is quite difficult, because the severities, which are really important in terms of what the forest mortality rates might be, and how that intersects with the species that are burnt, that's a really important thing. So that's something going forward that we will need to work out in terms of looking at the both short and longer term impacts. Another thing we need to be thinking about, and again, I'm sure I'm preaching to people here who know an awful lot about this, are the rainfall dynamics. And depending on whether we get, convective cells of a sort of 1 or 2 kilometre size that are dumping high intensity rainfall on us, as happened around La Cola in 2007 after the 2006-2007 fires. We can get things like that, or whether we get the kind of East Coast low type rainfall that sits over us for quite a few days, gives us quite a lot of rainfall, but the intensities are much less, so the likelihood of flash flooding is less. But these are the kind of things we also need to consider, and of course we've had a little bit of both almost recently, it seems. So that's another thing that's in the mix. And another really important one, if we're trying to think about the impacts, is what are the antecedent conditions have been. So this slide here just speaks to a little bit, I guess, to the fact that these are from our catchments, the Melbourne catchments, the main ones. We've done a little bit of looking at rainfall runoff ratios, and there's a few different periods there. The early part of most of the 20th century, then the millennium drought period, the period since that. But the main thing to notice, all those numbers in red are less than 1. So we're seeing in Melbourne's catchments, and I know that's not the entirety of the world, but for us it tends to be a bit, we're seeing a lot less rainfall consistently for quite a long time. And so that then of course means 2 things. One, there are often lots of soil moisture deficits, so the bucket is not very full, and secondly, it suggests that those catchments are drying in a dry condition much more often than perhaps they used to be. And this is just a plot of some of these soil moisture deficits. I won't go into how they were derived. They're kind of for the lower east coast of Australia, I think. But the main thing to notice, anything under the line means dry soil moisture conditions, and the arrows on the lower one are showing us when there were major fire intervals. I haven't updated that for this year, but we can see 03, 06, 07 and Black Saturday there, and they all come after these periods of long runs of low rainfall, so low rainfall anomalies. And this of course means that not only are the catchments very dry, but it also means the soil moisture bucket needs to be filled up before we get lots of runoff. So this is another thing in the short term impacts. Melbourne Water, for example, I don't think saw much of an increase in flow after Black Saturday because of the drought. So the soil moisture bucket is so low, the water that's not being evapotranspired is going back into storage. And so this is another factor that we'll need to think about. And then the other really key one from a forest hydrology point of view is what species is burnt. Now I'm pretty sure many of us here will know the mountain ash story. It's on the right-hand side. They're killed by medium to hot intensity fire. They're stand replacing fires, as they're called. They grow back as very dense, even aged regrowth. There is a lot of this in our landscape. You drive up to Marysville, for example, there's heaps of it after Black Saturday. There'll be a bit of this up in the alpine areas. Some of the alpine ash was burnt this time around, and has been in the past. Versus the kind of the rest of there's only 2 or 3 species that fall into the ash box. The rest of them are a mixed species eucalypts, and by and large they're pretty fire resistant. And that's most of the areas that were burnt consist of those mixed species. Many of them will come back in spring. We always get that headline, hope or something, where there's some green leaves coming out the side of a tree and everyone's amazed because they think the forest's been destroyed. This will happen. However, where the fire is really, really hot, sometimes the mortality rates can be significant, and that's where the effective regrowth can have an impact on the hydrology going forward. And just to put that into some numbers, the famous Kazera curve up the top there, George Kazera can't possibly believe that anybody uses this anymore, but it's still a beautiful conceptual model. So that you wouldn't necessarily believe, read things off the curve, but nevertheless there is this pronounced effect where once an older ash stand that's replaced by a younger ash stand, way around, sorry, a young ash stand replacing an older ash stand will use more water, and therefore there'll be a yield decline as it grows. Versus the mixed species, this is work that we did in the wake of Black Saturday, where the curves there are actually evapotranspiration curves, so the opposite of that is stream flow. And you'll see that there's some increased evapotranspiration, we think, from a moderate fire, because there's still canopy leaves as well as the epicormics and a lot of regrowth in the gaps. You might get a little bit less stream flow for a few years, versus a really hot fire is actually probably less ET because the leaves are gone and it takes a bit of time to recover. But if you look at the time frame there, for the ash we're talking decades, for the mixed species we're talking probably by 5 years or even less, and possibly 10 years at the max. Equilibrium has been, we've returned to equilibrium. So in overall, looking at fire maps and what's likely to happen, I wouldn't really expect a long-term impact unless there's really high mortality rates, and that we don't know as yet. And just to finish off, I will bring up one other thing that we've been working on a lot in our group, and other people have been thinking a little bit about, and this harks back to this fire frequency issue. This is really back to the ash, but in Melbourne we're pretty interested in this, and that is that if they're burnt at frequencies less than 20 years, they don't produce a seed stock. And that means they can't, and we've seen quite a few areas up in the alpine ash where that's happened. That means they can't regenerate, and they're often recolonised by acacias, which are kind of part of their community, and that leads to a species replacement. And this is, we think, quite plausible to happen on quite a wide scale if our fire frequencies are coming like they look like they are. And so that has a really profound ecological impact, but also a hydrologic one, which ironically is probably better for Melbourne water than the beautiful iconic ash, but probably not very palatable for lots of other reasons. And one of them also may be perhaps those systems are more flammable. So that's a bunch of work that's a number of people are working on going forward. So they're just a few ideas to get the discussion going, I guess, later on. This is not a lecture. And I'll hand over to Gary now, who talk about water quality, and this is much more interesting than mine, I think. He's got a video and everything. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. So, Gary, over to you.
Actually. Okay, so Pat's talked to you about the effect of fire on water yield. I'm going to talk about water quality. So water yield is a sort of multi-decadal scale problem. Water quality impacts last for several years generally, so a very different scale. And what I want to talk about is, I guess, that over the years of working on this topic, I started working on water quality after fire in about 2003. Over the years of working on our region and engaging with colleagues around the world, I've come to the conclusion that we live in a very special place here in Victoria, and we experience these extreme impacts on water quality as a function of fire, and we're amongst the outliers in the world between us and places like Western California. And I just want to go through a couple of slides to, I guess, put the case to you for that. So there's some key elements that I might just turn this on so I can wander around. There's some key elements that lead to us having a really extreme post-fire erosion and water quality risk. We have these really highly productive forests that are extremely flammable. We have extreme fire weather and climate conditions. We experience these very unusual high magnitude erosion events that aren't particularly common around the world, and our landscapes are particularly prone to them. And then we have some embedded sort of water supply vulnerabilities in our supply network in Victoria. So I'll just go through those in a little bit of more detail. So the first one, our forests are amongst the most productive terrestrial ecosystems in the world. These forests can burn and then they'll regenerate fuels within a number of years. So you can go back 5 years later into a lot of forest and the fuel loads are back at extreme levels. The fuels are also extremely flammable because eucalyptus leaves have a lot of oils and resins that make them flammable. And then we have this sort of cycle of drying and wetting that means, or seasonal cycles where the system's highly productive, but then it's also extremely dry in summer. So we have this climate that really creates really a loaded gun in our system. And then these systems surround our water supply infrastructure. So in particular, the Thompson and the Upper Yarra, the Maroona, are all surrounded by these highly flammable systems. We have this extreme fire climate and fire weather. So we have very large interannual variability in temperature and rainfall. We have these patterns of high maximum summer temperatures when we have this build-up of hot air over central Australia, which then meets a blocking system that funnels all that hot air down over Victoria, like on Black Saturday, 100 kilometre an hour winds, 40 degree plus temperatures. So we have this extreme pattern of fire weather. And then we have this extreme wind change. So the long pencil-shaped first run of the fire in the morning then changes to a very broad front as the wind changes to the south to the southwest, and we get this really broad fire front. So we have very intense fire and burns very large areas. And when that happens, it's really, the system is just explosive. There's nothing really we can do under these fire conditions. It's really just get out of the way. And this leads to these really large areas burned of our steep forested landscape, large areas burnt to very high intensities. So for example, the big fire year we just had in Victoria, I think it was 1.5 million hectares. So we've had over 1.2 million hectares 3 times in the last 20 years. So that kind of size of fire is not unusual in this corner of the world, and that's as a function of this fire weather. The next thing that causes us to have this particularly high risk is we have this process called post-fire debris flows. So most places where you get fire and erosion, you have sort of quite mild erosion processes, rill and interrill. But we have this very high magnitude process, and I'll just show you a video to sort of illustrate how it differs. So this is an after a fire, this is a debris flow Germany. But it'll show you the difference between normal erosion damage and a debris flow. You can see some material moving into the stream there, and as it comes past the camera plant, you see the material coming down the stream. It's not so much like dirty water. after the fire, we're able to see the results of these kind of events. They leave behind a whole lot of telltale signs, geomorphic signs. And so we're able to tell whether a debris flow happened or just a normal kind of erosion event. So these typically move very large boulders, so boulders the size of cars. These are coming from landscapes that are very steep. This was in near La Cola in 2007. These guys almost got swept off the road. And these can have very big impacts on infrastructure, so they destroy roads. The next one was from 2015 near Myrtleford. So that one just had a planned burn in the catchment behind it, so quite a low severity burn combined with a high intensity rainfall event. But in the worst case, it can lead to fatalities. And so this was an event in California in 2018 in Montecito. So I think it was the station fire. So this post-fire debris flow event resulted in more than 25 fatalities and hundreds of people injured and hundreds of homes destroyed. And this environment is particularly prone to debris flows, but we have debris flows of this size in Victoria as well. We've measured debris flows like this. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude, so this is a 2-ton boulder sitting 4 metres up a tree in a channel. So they reckon that debris flow coming down the channel was about 8.5 metres deep when it came down. So that boulder was floating on top of the debris coming down. So they're very viscous kind of flow. And when I started working on this, I didn't even know what a debris flow was. We just started measuring erosion rates from a whole lot of catchments. So the storm event erosion rates from all these research catchments. We spent lots of time and money measuring this. And then once we started measuring debris flows, we realised that we were onto the case of where we really need to focus our efforts. So about a 2 to 3 order of magnitude increase in the loads when we get debris flows. And much of that material is clay and colloids, which moves into the reservoir. So this is a post-fire flood event. Some of this was contributed by debris flows and some of it from normal flood flow. This is Glen Maggie. So that's one of the processes that leads to this high magnitude impact. One of other factors that contributes to the high risk is some vulnerabilities in our network. So a vegetated catchment is a great thing for water quality. It's like a big cheap water treatment plant. All those beautiful porous soils clean the water for us. And that means that we've built these catchments with very little treatment capacity, so we can't treat high loads that come out after fire. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, the advantage of having these really high quality water. So that's a vulnerability we have in our system. The second vulnerability we have is quite peculiar to us, I think, in that we've got Melbourne's population over here. We've got the Thompson here where we get 40% of our water, the Upper Yarra where we get another 20%, but all of the water from the Thompson has to come via the Upper Yarra. So if the Upper Yarra burns, 60% of Melbourne's water will be unavailable. And we've done modelling to look at the level of contamination, and the contamination will last for many months in that system, at least months if it is hit by debris flows after fire. So I've put the case to you that these factors lead to this extreme risk in Victoria. So you might well ask, why is it that our Melbourne's water supply hasn't been interrupted by fire yet? We haven't had our water supply interrupted by fire. So it's kind of been off the radar a little bit. And I'll just mention a couple of things. So firstly, the last time the catchments were burnt severely was in 1939. The 1939 fires, the entire catchment were burnt at high severity, which has created our ash forest there. The reservoirs were built in 57 and 83, and the average recurrence interval of these fires in these wet forests, like the mountain ash forest, is about 80 years. So if you look at those numbers there, we're kind of due for a big, severe fire in our water supply catchments. So one of the things we do is after fires like this is we try and raise funding first, and secondly go out and measure things with that funding so that we can identify the level of risk we're exposed to and try and work out which parts of the landscape are most at risk, which ones are safe and we don't need to worry about, using a whole lot of different field methods. And all of that takes all of these people, and with that I'll thanks.
Thanks, Gary. So now, can I invite all three panel members to please come and take a seat on the front? So we have heard from Patrick and Gary. So I think I can perhaps start with Jeff by kicking off a question. So on the basis of what Pat and Gary have been telling us, what kind of impacts you can, what do you understand out of the case Gary was making and the impacts on stream flow Patrick was talking about? What can we understand for the implications on the broader level catchment water availability from all this?
So I guess obviously all the water quality risks is a big immediate risk that the water sector, or the water corporations and the water sector more broadly takes very seriously, and there's a lot of operational aspects to that to manage that risk, but that's not something that I really cover in my work. So I guess my work's really more around the long-term water availability, and so I guess for the water sector, what we do is we invest in the research, but then we actually want to understand, well, what do these changes mean for water availability at a catchment scale, at a water supply system scale. So we really want to pull together this sort of research scale knowledge, and then understand, well, what do different fire severities mean? What does the past fire history mean? Getting a bit of feedback. To then say, well, when we do have fire events, what does that mean for long-term yields? Mm-hmm. And so there's been a lot of work done that requires a lot of modelling, a lot of assumptions, of course. There's a lot of sort of uncertainties around that, but we want to understand, when you pull it all together, look broad scale, what does that mean? And so there's been a lot of work done to do that over previous fires, and up to the 2003 fire, and then the 06-07 fires, both of which were over 1 million hectares each. There was work done to actually look at, well, what do they mean? Broad scale impact across all of those catchments for water availability. And so I think, and over the time, there's been better knowledge about what the mixed species response to fire. So some of the previous broad scale assessments had some very big numbers about impacts on yield. But I think with the learnings from how species have recovered in some cases after those earlier fire events, we have better knowledge about then what does that mean for yields. So the numbers essentially have sort of been, the estimates of impact have reduced significantly from some of those earlier assessments that were made. And so there is numbers available from the impact of some of those earlier fires, but then we also want to understand, well, we know that, after 20 or 30 years we'll get that sort of dip in those curves, so that's when the sort of yield impact is greatest. But what's our chance of getting fires in the future that might then sort of mean those declines are never realised? So yeah, ultimately it's about, from a water availability point of view, trying to understand all that and put it together with everything else that's going on in the system.
All right, thanks, Jeff. I think for the next question, perhaps you need to hold it a little bit closer. So, Patrick, can I ask you one difficult question? So we have been talking about various reasons which could have brought us to the fires, but what, in your opinion, brought us to this point? Was it climate change? Was it the way we have been managing the bush? So what do you think was the major driver of getting us into this situation?
Thank you. Well, this is a very topical topic, isn't it? and it's died down slightly in the last few weeks, but it was raging on social media and everywhere else not that long ago. Look, I guess I'm presuming most of us here would probably feel that the climate is really the big driver here. That those plots I put up of soil moisture deficits, which are really rainfall deficits, show us that we have prolonged periods where there's just a lot less rain, and so our landscapes are drying, and they're drying rapidly, and they're drying a lot. So we've had from most of the east coast of Australia almost down to Melbourne, down to Melbourne's catchments. The bush has been very, very dry for a long time. In fact, we missed out on this last year by it rained a bit or there was some decent rain late in the year in New South Wales, but they had fires up there in winter. We obviously had the Thomson fire here, so the dots were almost joined up then. The bush is very dry, the climate is warming and drying, and the discussions around our management of forests, which is a pretty political one, really there's very little evidence to show that controlled burning can stop a raging wildfire. What it can do is slow the rate of spread of a fire when it first starts, if the conditions aren't too extreme, and so it does give a little bit more of a chance to get on top of it before it gets too big. But I was only talking to someone yesterday or the day before who had overlaid a map of controlled burning and fire severity, and there was no apparent impact. Now that's a very crude analysis, I might hasten to say, and he said as well, but nevertheless it's not really obvious that if you do lots of controlled burning you don't get the fire. So certainly it can help. It helps in terms of hopefully slowing the fires, and if it's not done, we tend to focus on what it didn't do. We often don't think about what it has done, that perhaps the fire would have been worse had we done little of it. But it's from my understanding of the issue, it's not a panacea. That the climate and the conditions are really the bigger driver.
So with that statement, what do you think we can do better? Is better surveillance the option way forward?
That's a really interesting question, because again, the part of this discussion I was with the other day, there was an economist there with forthright views, as economists have, and he was saying, well look, so in the state of Victoria we spend, I think on average, something like $200 million on controlled burning on average every year. So if you multiply that over New South Wales and elsewhere, it's a lot of money. And a lot of that has come out of the Royal Commission we had after Black Saturday, of course, when targets were mandated. That's a thing that people have to do, that the government has to do, DELP has to do. But the economist was arguing, look, if you're spending this much, shouldn't you spend $100 million on surveillance and rapid response aircraft, etc., etc. And so when you see that fire, which from our remote sensing abilities, etc., we should be able to see instantaneously, you dispatch something there really fast and put it out. And that's another really interesting discussion. Would that be more effective? But it probably misses the point that there are, which I didn't make just before, there are certain circumstances, and I guess Gary's probably really highlighted one, where there are particular assets that probably need special protection, and perhaps that is where these kind of measures, allied with surveillance and rapid response, perhaps is the options that we need. And around our catchments, you might argue that these are pretty important, as is towns, other infrastructure, etc., etc. So, but that's a really interesting one. Our technological advances are such that we could be perhaps better at that part of it.
Thanks, Pat. I think there is an interesting question perhaps for you, Gary. How does the risk of water quality impacts vary across the landscape at regional, global and continental scales?
Yeah, so you can think about it broadly across sort of internationally and continentally, depending on the kind of erosion process that you generate. There's like a hierarchy of processes from sort of raindrop-driven processes to flow-driven processes to things like debris flows and channel scour, and they kind of, each time you shift from one process to next, you kind of go up an order of magnitude really in the total amount of erosion. So understanding what the dominant process is, you know, in Darwin's catchments versus Adelaide's catchments, for example, is a really good first cut sort of broad way of going, this place is going to have real problems with its water quality and this place is not going to have too much problem. And then, so that kind of idea works sort of globally. And then locally, this was something that really had us sort of flummoxed for many years. So all the literature was saying what happens after fire. The fire heats up the soil becomes hydrophobic or sort of water-fearing. And so whereas the soil before was like a big sponge sort of soaking up all the water, after fire it becomes like a big sheet of plastic, and all that water shoots off and picks up all the soil and ash that's available now because the vegetation's gone, picks all that up and washes it down the hill. And so we went around everywhere measuring water repellents on all these different places, and you know, everywhere was water repellent after the fire. But some places had these really big impacts on water quality, like, you know, hundreds of tonnes per hectare. Other places had almost no impact. And unfortunately, we started all our work in a place that had no impact, and that took up the first few years of our research program. But what it turned out to be was that so water repellence happens across all these forest soils. It's natural, even when the system isn't burnt, it just gets enhanced after fire. And then there's two fundamental things that kind of interact. The soils that are well structured, they get water repellent, but the water is able to sort of go through the water repellent layer. There's like these gaps in the water repellent layer. So even though it's highly water repellent, if you measure it, the water finds these little gaps. And then in the poorer soils, there's none of those gaps because the soil just isn't as productive and doesn't have the worms and the roots and things like that to create these channels. And so in those soils, when they burn and they get water repellent, then they just shed all their water. So they might shed like 80% of rainfall becomes surface runoff on those hill slopes. Whereas these ones over here, which are also extremely water repellent, almost no runoff comes off them. And so that took a long time to work that out. Yeah.
Thanks, Gary. There is another one as a follow-up pretty much to that one. So what are the possible measures we can take prior to severe fires to minimize the impact on water resources? So can we do something beforehand so that we are not actually contaminating our supply?
Yeah, so from a sort of water contamination perspective, so we can build redundancy into the water supply system. So the desal plant is an example of that. Having the capacity to shift water from one reservoir to another is another example. Preventing the fire from getting into the catchment in the first place. So, you know, Melbourne has a network of hundreds of kilometres of sort of upgraded fire breaks. Thanks. Fire breaks, and they have their own standing firefighting force, so they can focus on their own assets when the fire does come. So there's the fire protection, the building in the redundancy, and then if you do get a fire, there are sort of hill slope and erosion treatments you can do. You can invest in a treatment plant. I understand that's in the order of billions of dollars for Melbourne's water supply. So Melbourne Water is actually looking at a lot of these options at the moment, I understand. So different kinds of mitigation and sort of insurance methods, I guess, for protection against bushfire contamination.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned insurance, and desalination has been seen as one of the insurance investment for Melbourne water supply. But does any one of you have views on cities which don't have access to sea? How can they protect their water supply from bushfire and other risks?
So I think it's really a question for the people who run those systems and know those systems. I think, and that's I guess not my role in the department. Obviously, I guess there operationally there can be a whole bunch of options. I think in the Victorian case, water corporations are well aware of the many risks they face, including risks around bushfires, and so yeah. So I guess yeah. So I guess in terms of access to the sea, I'm not sure that's necessarily so relevant to Victoria. But I think there's lots of options that all the water corporations have to consider all the things that they can do to manage their risks.
Things like, say, in the Ovens Valley, so they get a lot of bushfire impacts on water quality, and so I noticed recently they've added so they take their water from the Ovens River, and they've added a lot of offline storages, so they can fill those storages up. That's what I think they're doing. Fill those storages up and then draw from those storages while the stream water, gets contaminated for these short pulses, like days, and then the water goes through, and then they can go back to taking their water from the stream. And then in the smaller communities, they end up trucking water in semi-trailers where that's feasible.
Yeah, also groundwater bores are another option that's not impacted by fires in the same way.
Yeah. All right. There is another interesting question. Do we know how much carbon has gone into the atmosphere from these latest fires? Is there long-term modeling into climate change impacts or any feedback effects?
I don't know. I don't know if any of us know the number, but it is very big. But there is a lot of modelling, measurement and modelling of that. But it's clearly a very big number. From this year, it's a huge number. But there is lots of people working on that carbon side of it. Just that none of them are sitting here, I don't think. We can make it up there. I mean, we are really interested in the sort of the conjoined processes of carbon and water, because clearly the way that plants operate, they assimilate carbon and release water while they're doing it, so they're intimately connected. So there's a lot of interesting work to be done around that in the light of fire and drought that's going on at the moment, and we're doing initiating quite a bit of work on that too. But the continental carbon budget work other people are doing, I'm sure there'll be lots of stuff coming out very soon on that.
And I mean, there's kind of a offsetting in that, you lose all that carbon in the fire, but then the forest regrows and draws all that carbon back down again. So the longer term questions are around really if the structure of the forest changes because of these repeated fires, and as it dries and gets hotter, the canopy opens and the soils start to lose their carbon, and they're, a really large fraction of forest carbon sits in the soil.
Yeah. There is another one. The frequency, Gary, you said the last severe fires were like 180 years ago. And with your previous study to improve our ability to predict the bushfire impacts, could you use that study to predict the impacts better for the future fires, given that climate variability and severity is only going to get worse?
Yeah, so that's one of the things we try to do. So one of the questions of people like Jeff's group is how will the risks change into the future? And so the key things in there are the frequency and severity of fires, so trying to model how a drying landscape with hotter summer temperatures will translate into higher frequency, which is a very difficult thing to try and model. So presumably we'll have more fires because Victoria's losing rainfall and summer's maximum temperatures are getting hotter. And then on the other side of that, the rainfall events that trigger these debris flows, they're very intense, short duration storms. So only like 10 or 15 minute storms are the ones that generate thousands of tons of sediment. And the probability of those intense storms is increasing with increasing temperature in a known way. But the magnitude of increase that's been observed is quite a bit higher than people were expecting. based on the temperature increases. So we're sort of seeing increases in the probability of intense storms, higher than we expected, and at the same time we're likely to get more fires. So both sides of the equation are kind of pushing in the wrong direction for this process.
Gary, this is a question perhaps both for Pat and Gary. In your study, have you applied the CSIRO climate change projections to undertake future risk analysis of bushfire on both the water quality as well as water supply yield?
I mean, we have done in the past. I did some work some years ago looking at on the Thompson actually about what was going to be worse, fires or climate, and the climate was worse than burning the hell out of the Thompson. That was during the Millennium Drought where CSIRO had produced sort of low, medium and high climate change scenarios, and at the time it was kind of like, oh, we've got to put a high one in, and then within a year or two of them doing that, we were there. So that was pretty scary, that had a much bigger impact than the fire. If you multiply them together, which I was a bit reluctant to do because I didn't really know much about the feedbacks, it's probably not very promising. There are a number of climate scenarios that DELP use, and also I think Melbourne Water, that we will be incorporating into our work going forward in that. So the answer is yes. We need those forward projections to drive our models, and so we'll be using those. And with those, as Gary said, there are synthetic rainfall surfaces series that include the intensity duration statistics that are also really important for what we're talking about.
Thanks, Pat. Jeff?
Yeah, maybe I could just add to that too. So, so with the guidance around and the projections that we have for future water availability from climate change, what that means for rainfall and therefore water availability, we're currently working to update that guidance now, and that's in conjunction with the research program we have with a range of research partners called the Victorian Water and Climate Initiative. And so we are looking at what does the latest climate science say about rainfall, how does that match with trends that we've observed, particularly since 1997 in Victoria and Southern Australia, so that reduction in the cool season rainfall that we're getting. And so I guess the research program is very much looking to update that advice and get the latest projections, and that can then feed into all the work that goes on across the sector. But one of the questions really is, what does, for the water sector, we want to know what climate change means for rainfall and then water availability. But we also want to know, well, how does that match with, or how does bushfire impacts on yield become part of that story too? And so I think there is a lot of work around that gives some evidence and ability to compare. So Pat gave an example there, but I think there's other information that shows really the direct impact of climate change and rainfall, and then what that means for water availability is likely to be a much bigger amount than the impact declines due to bushfires, even though bushfire frequency obviously may well change.
Thanks, Jeff. Do you have anything to add, Gary?
I could add that, so in the scenarios around fire and climate change, there's the potential, the vegetation is a big term in the water balance. Pat put up the numbers there, 30, 50%, depending on the rainfall. But there's the potential for the effects of climate change to be either, exacerbated or reduced as a function of the vegetation change, because that's such a big term. So if fire frequency changes, the type of forest or the age structure, you could see a real multiplier effect or a dampening effect.
Yeah. Thanks, Gary. There is another important question. So in light of this major risk, how important do you think we should start prioritizing alternative water, recycled water, for example, or storm water?
They're going to.
Jeff?
Jeff,
Yeah,
you
Jeff.
want to do it?
I think well beyond my area really, but obviously there's a whole lot of work going on in alternative water supplies. Obviously that's an important part of the equation. Yeah, so it's all important to be considered.
Could I ask a question of Jeff?
Sure.
I guess in planning, in a scenario modelling sense, does that appear in the DELP kind of thinking around catchments, etc. much?
So not quite maybe sure of the question, but I guess in terms of there's a lot of planning around obviously water availability into the future that takes into account all the different supplies available, including alternative water supplies. So there's a whole lot of work going on in that space. So it's absolutely part of it's all. Yeah, I mean there are challenges to maybe in modelling sense to sort of pull some of these things together, but there is a whole lot of work going on.
An interesting thing I will say, we have an urban hydrology group in our school who they will say Melbourne doesn't have a problem with too little water. We've got a problem with too much water. So there's plenty of water. It's just that most of it goes down the drain, and so the question I think really addresses that issue of harvesting, all the water that lands on our impervious surfaces and putting it to good use. But of course, that's a very big retrofitting engineering feat, which many of you will know much more about than I will. But there is.
And I think the Water for Future document talks about all sources of water supply, rainwater, stormwater, and recycled water as well. So I think next question is, what is the long-term impact of sediment flows on the soil's ability to support forests? Because the soil is going to be moved, so how does it impact on the forest regrowth?
So this is something we've been working a lot on in the last sort of 5 or 6 years. The kind of feedbacks between the erosion processes, the vegetation and the fire regime and the soils. So what we published recently, some research where we looked at north-facing and south-facing slopes across the Victorian uplands, and we put forward the hypothesis that the soils were shallower on the north slopes because they were being stripped basically by these fire events. So we built a model that incorporated soil production, soil erosion, fire, other erosion processes, and then used that model to test the hypothesis that fire was actually like a geomorphic driver of the soils in our mountains. And that turned out to be the case. So you can't really get the patterns of soil depth that we see in our uplands without including fire-related erosion in the model. So we developed this model and we turned the fire-related erosion off, and then we turned it back on again, and we said which one matches the patterns of soil depth. So sort of fire and erosion at sort of millennial scales, I guess, is leaving this sort of signature across the landscape of the soils, and therefore the vegetation that can be supported, the types of forests.
So it is an interesting one where we probably haven't really seen the expression of that in the shorter terms. As Gary said, this is a long-term process, and it's to do with, it's hotter on a north-facing slope than a south-facing slope, so it burns more often. But we've measured nutrient loading losses from these kind of slopes, and at some stage there's not quite enough soil and not quite enough nutrients there to keep those flourishing. So how quickly that happens is an interesting question. I don't think we could go to anywhere since, say, 2003 when the big fires have started happening and go, there's less trees on there because of this, but may well be in 50 years' time we will.
Thanks, Pat. There is another cheeky one. So climate driver is universal, but where have you noticed governance failure to avoid bushfire and water resources management? So climate change is universal. It's happening everywhere, but in Australia, did you think the governance failure was one of the reasons to get into these bushfire seasons?
Government failure, policy failure has contributed to bushfires. Well, no. I don't think so, because obviously it takes a lot longer to turn the ship around than, a couple of decades. But I guess what my view would be that if we don't start, we should have started as a nation to do something about our emissions a long time ago, and as part of our role as a global citizen that are an affluent country should be leading in this space. So if the question was, has the government's policies led to the bushfires, then the answer is no. But that kind of policy won't stop this problem going forward. Does that make sense? Time frames aren't quite, matching up there, but eventually they will.
All right. So in response to the water use, is there any ongoing research for innovation in efficiency in water use and making use of the limited resource? So are we just going to work towards the supply side of it, or there is work on being more efficient?
So I guess that's sort of, getting right into the sort of water supply sort of planning side of things. So I guess there's been a lot of work over a long time at different levels around ensuring secure supplies, and that's not just on the supply side, but also on demand side as well. There's Target 155 in Melbourne now, so there's been a whole lot of work over many years on the demand side, as well as the supply side. Including alternative water supplies and things like that too. So I guess that's all a part of the broader kind of water supply planning question. And
there is an interesting question. As we just discussed, there is going to be change in the forest composition because of these huge bushfires. How is it going to impact the catchment yield in longer term?
Well, I guess that was kind of what I was trying to get at, was that it will depend a lot on basically, it's down to how many trees die, really. But mainly from the fires that we had, there will be some areas of alpine ash up in that Victorian high country that have the mountain ash type response, the Kazera response. But overall, the vast majority of the forests were burnt were mixed species eucalypts, which are quite fire resistant. There are some reports of some very high intensity areas where there may be significant death. It's a bit hard to tell yet, because even though they've lost all their leaves, they might just spring back into gear in spring, literally. So we won't know for a little while, but in some areas there's some species where we're not quite sure that there may be high mortality rates, and their regeneration processes are very vigorous. In that case, perhaps there is a water loss for some time. After that, so you've got that decreased ET to start with, so you should get a bit more water, or you might, and then it's once they start recovering when the increased evapotranspiration can happen, and that's when the losses can go down. But overall, I don't think there'll be a massive impact. But I guess even some of our work suggested that with a certain burn intensity in the mixed species, you might get a 10-20% increase in evapotranspiration for 2 or 3 years. If you're in drought, that might be most of the water that's coming out of your catchment normally. So perhaps that's and it's untangling those two things, which is a bit tricky in this space. You need to deal with the climate signal as well as the tree physiology signal. But overall, I doubt, from what we know, I don't think there'll be a massive impact, but there could, in some places, there could be something noticeable. At the moment, we're more likely to get more water for a year or two, but although, as I said, there's a pretty empty soil bucket out there that needs filling before you get the spillover. But for most of the areas that were burnt, if you go back there in 3 years' time, although the trunks will be a bit black, if you look up, you probably wouldn't necessarily know there was a fire for many of them. Some of them in the drier areas have been really hard hit, then it will take longer. But Yep, I mean, nature, eucalypts are very good at this. You know, Gary and I always remember going to the US and driving around with people who work in this kind of business, and we'd drive past this area that has been burnt, and we'd say, oh, when was that burnt? Expecting them to say last year or the year before, and it was like, 15 years before. So they're a lot of the world's forests are very slow responding, whereas our eucalypts love it. That's why they're here. Eucalypts are here because they love fire. It's just that, the ash in particular, they go the whole hog with it and die and then all come back madly, which has the big effect. But mostly speaking, that's not what will occur. I think.
Another interesting thing there, I think, like with, so Pat put up the slide about sort of species change, so the mountain ash might change to a different species if the fire frequency is such that the forest burns before the forest reaches maturity, sexual maturity, so it can't reproduce. So there's some really strong kind of non-linearities in the system. So, if you get the right fire frequency, you could hold those ash forests at their maximum water use age class, or if you get a slightly different fire frequency, they could disappear completely and you get a completely different system that has completely different water use. But that can be, there could be only slight difference in the fire frequency that would cause that. So being able to predict the future is hard with those really strong non-linearities.
Mm-hmm. We are almost getting to the time, but there is an interesting one. What major ecological effects of Victorian fires we can expect to see in the next few years?
Ecological?
Yeah.
Okay, here we I mean, I guess if I was to answer that, I'd probably say some of them are fairly straightforward. Like I said, eucalypts are really good at dealing with fire. They'll come back either a little bit quicker or a little bit slower, depending on how much rain we get in the next couple of years. And that was interesting after Black Saturday. Things recovered really fast because although we were at the tail end of the drought, of course we all remember that only a couple of years later there were floods everywhere. So that, the recovery was quite quick for many of the forests. But I think those areas that have been burnt multiple times in short succession, that's the one that we are really unsure about, because even a vegetation system that's ecologically fire is a massive part of it. It's probably not thinking it's going to get burnt every 5 years. And so the change in forest structure then, which means maybe we have less understory species, perhaps there's a bit more mortality, those other sort of shrub species come into the mix, that can be potentially quite significant. And again, if you open up, as Gary said, you open up the canopy, then it's going to be drier more often, there might be more fire. So the sort of the positive feedback going on there is possible. This is where there's quite a bit of work kicking off now, because we've kind of gone through this sequence in the last 16, 17 years of what happens after a single fire event, and now we're realising there are areas that are having multiples, and there's really hasn't been much research around that. There's a concept called the tolerable fire interval, which is kind of used, or at least in the past has been used in terms of how often should you control burn. And this is this idea that you can't keep burning ecosystems every couple of years because eventually they will change. And so it's a really interesting question which I don't know the answer to, but a lot of people are very interested in it. And for good or for ill, we have quite a lot of field sites.
Right, there is one last interesting question as well for any one of you who wants to answer. In 2100, do you think we will still be using water from forested catchments? Can we meet Melbourne's water demand just with recycled and desalinated water?
Great question. You want to go, Jeff?
Bit hard to say. I mean, there's obviously a whole bunch of challenges that the world faces. That are sort of well beyond just water supply. So I mean, it depends maybe how we go with all these other challenges as to then where we're at with how we're dealing with the water supply in a relatively affluent place that we have now. So yes, I guess it depends on a whole range of things. So don't know.
There's a room full of engineers here who have sorted out for us. I mean, I think it's the interesting thing about our water supply system at the moment for Melbourne is that, you know, water from the catchments is cheap. You know, it's the rain falls for free. Gravity brings it down to us, largely speaking. You've got to pump a little bit about. Of course, you have to, you know, keep the infrastructure up and go and chase deer around and, you know, put a bit of stuff in the water, all those kind of things. But in general, it's extraordinarily cheap compared to the desal plant. But a colleague of ours once worked out about 5 or 6 years ago that each of us had about 20 square metres of, maybe cubic metres anyway. We all had a patch of forest that could be ours. So, and maybe we should decide what we should do on it. Maybe one of us might love that really big tree, but somebody else might go, well, I'm going to get rid of that big tree because for my 20 square metres I want more water. So that 20 square metres is shrinking because since he did those sums, we've probably got another 1.5 million people. So that is a really interesting one that eventually there's got, you know, the lines have got to converge to the state to the stage where the catchments won't be enough, and I guess that's where hopefully all the other work around alternative water supplies will have come to the fore by then. The difficulty, of course, is that if it happens really quickly, and it nearly happened in the 2000s. When Black Saturday came, as many of us remember, we had less than 30% storage, and some of that I think was unobtainable. It was so far down in the Thompson. And we had the Black Saturday fires, which fortunately wasn't as severe in the catchments as it might have been. And you know, we had only had one bad day. Obviously, it was a terrible day, but most of our fires run for weeks. And if that had happened then you know, we were in serious trouble in Melbourne. You know, it only takes an event like that, and Gary said earlier, the Upper Yarra is very, and therefore 60% of our water is very vulnerable to a fire. How quickly we can bring those other alternative technologies to boot, you know, we might have we might get shoved really fast one of these days.
Right, thanks, Pat. I think we are already at time. So can I ask each one of you to provide one take-home message?
He didn't ask us this. All right, I'll go with one. I think that we do need to realise, and I reckon most people do here, that we are in a bit of a new reality as regarding fire and our natural environment, and therefore all the ecosystem services. And that, joined to the last question, I suppose, I think we need to be thinking really seriously about how we're going to manage going forward, because the future is here.
Thanks, Pat.
Yeah, I guess mine would be, I'm just reading a book by Nassim Taleb called The Black Swan. I don't know if anybody's read it. It's about sort of outside, focusing too much on the regular things that happen every day at the expense of these big outside events that have really big impacts. And I guess I kind of feel like some of these things, like, you know, big debris flows that get into houses and kill people, and large impacts on water supplies like Melbourne's water supply. They're kind of outside events, outside the frame of normal planning, but they've really got the potential to have a really big impact. They might only happen once every 100 years or something, but when they do, the impact will be large and significant.
Thank you. Jeff.
So maybe just that I think it's really important to always keep in mind the bigger picture. So often I feel like sometimes in the water sector we get focused on a certain study, a certain number, certain particular issue, but I think we always need to look at the broader picture, understand the broader challenges around what we're needing to manage, without just getting too focused on one particular problem, say around water supply or whatever that is.
Thank you. And with that, I would like to thank all three speakers today, and I'll ask you to join me in thanking the speakers. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for being here today. So another round of applause for yourself as well. And I would just like to say, don't forget the next event, which is scheduled on 11th of March. It's on gender equality in water. It's going to be chaired by our enterprise fellow, Sharon Davis, and we have an excellent lineup of speakers for that seminar as well. So it's going to be at the same venue. Please book it in your diaries, and we look forward to see you back here next month. Thank you very much.